Now, the real estate regulatory bill will be passed. In fact, I have with me Gulam Zia of Night Rank. Thank you so much, Mr. Zia, for joining in. Before I bring Nantara into the conversation, prima facie, how will this change the landscape of the real estate sector?
Well, it's a landmark day as far as real estate is concerned. It will actually give the due to the buyer, the home buyer who was suffering for so long. So at last, with this passage, we can say that for real estate, consumer at last will be the king.
How concerned are you about the actual implementation of the bill? It's passed now, yes, but how concerned are you that it may not get implemented, or there may be clauses in the process of it getting implemented?
Well, one thing which I take heart from is that this whole act is very time-bound. First of all, they haven't given much of a leeway for state government to actually have their way. A lot of the fundamental important issues or clauses are really something which they can't negotiate on. So that's one aspect, that they can't be diluted by various state bodies, and then ultimately there's a time-bound program. For next 3 months something to be done, 6 months something to be done, in a year you have to have it really active and on ground. So it's not something which you can escape from, so it's on your face.
Hi Gulam, this is Nantara from the New Delhi studio. Good to have you here. For over 10 years, I've actually been tracking the real estate regulator. It's finally looking like it's going to be a reality. What I want to begin by asking you is, are you convinced that this is really going to protect consumers? And the reason I ask you this is because personally, I was disappointed that there is nothing in the bill that talks about time-bound approvals from any municipality, any state government, any central agency. And that has been one major roadblock in getting project approvals, in consumers getting their projects on time. And time is money.
Well, I could start saying this, that for so long we had the biggest issues or the grievances that we have been looking at have been between a buyer and the seller. And I agree that the government authorities or the approving authorities do play an extremely important role, but I'm sure that's something which will be included in over a period of time. But as far as the bill itself is concerned, it's something at least taking you a few steps closer to a perfect situation. I understand that this is still not an ideal and a perfect bill, but over a period of time, I'm sure these things will be taken into account. But at least to begin with, between the developers and the buyers, it's a great beginning.
And Gulam, that 70% lock-in, we've seen plenty of back and forth on that 70% and 50% and 70%. When it went to Parliament today, it was going to be a 70% lock-in. Should buyers take umbrage from the fact that their funds are not going to be diverted by builders to buy other land, put for other projects, maybe even refinance other debt sitting in their books? Do you think it's a good move, or do you think it's inflationary in nature, where the builders might actually raise prices because they lose fungibility?
Gulam, just hold that thought. Nantara, the Rajya Sabha has passed the real estate regulator bill. They were voting for the last 1 hour, and the real estate regulator bill has been passed. You heard Mr. Zia's comments, and you can answer Nantara's concerns now.
I'm sorry, I missed your question. I was so excited to hear that at last it is passed. So it's a historic day for the real estate in the country. Sorry, I have to ask you to repeat that question, Nantara.
Yeah, Gulam, what I was asking you, and I also want to do this because we are also home buyers. And finally I've been tracking this story for 10 years, so even I'm quite excited about it. But Gulam, what I wanted to ask you was that this is certainly going to bring transparency into the sector. We're going to see more punch being added to the buyer. Do you have absolutely any fears on this red letter day that maybe, just maybe, there's going to be too much concentration of power with this regulator?
Not really. First of all, if you read the speech that the minister gave towards the end of it, while answering the questions, he did mention that the local regulatory bodies will have their role very clearly carved out and not disturbed at all. So, like for example, the state housing boards, etc., will have their activities not challenged. So it's only as far as the relationship between a buyer and a seller is something which currently it is taking full charge of, and that is for me a positive view. And if you're asking about the negatives, well, you said that before we got into this question, we were discussing about it, that for a better implementation, the authorities should also be must be brought under the umbrage of this act. I'm sure it will happen over a period of time.
All right, we'll get back to Mr. Zia. Just hang in over there. We have Rajeev Talwar, Group Executive Director of DLF, joining in now on the phone line. Mr. Talwar, the bill has been passed. The Rajya Sabha and the Upper House have passed the real estate regulator bill. Your initial prima facie comments on this, concerns, if any?
No, first of all, congratulations. This should be a big step, and we respect the wisdom of the Parliament as well as the government, and we welcome the bill. Of course, there are some very stringent provisions which we thought perhaps should not be there. It's a civil industry, and therefore in the provisions of imprisonment should not be there. The threshold for properties has been lowered, as the minister said in the Rajya Sabha, to 500 square yards, which is a very welcome signal. Also, what the speaker before me spoke, that yes, state authorities and state housing boards should be brought under the ambit of the bill. That will happen over a period of time, I'm certain. Secondly, there should be somebody made accountable. As the minister spoke about transparency and accountability, someone should be made accountable for the time taken for approvals. And as some of the honorable members of parliament mentioned, that yes, there should be some single window clearance, which seems impossible at the moment to identify.
That has to be, that is very far away. A single window clearance, let's get real. That I don't even know if that's going to happen in my lifetime. If you look at all the approvals that are needed by the municipalities, the state governments, the centre, let's hope there will be. But what is possible right now? And before we also get very excited, all you developers are very soon going to have to pass on a lot of information to the regulatory authorities, because from what I understand, this bill actually has a retrospective effect where it says where you have not got a completion certificate. So for all your ongoing projects, a company like DLF, once you have the authority in place, is going to have to pass on a lot of paperwork. What I want to ask you is that how are you going to assure your consumers watching you now that that bureaucracy is not going to get in the way of handing over projects on time?
Well, bureaucracy, I mean, I don't think we should blame anyone as a single authority or a single agency which causes delay. I think the best way out, which according to me personally should be the way forward in India, is to say that no sale of apartments is allowed till the shell is complete. Because let the buyer see what he's going to buy. Let the buyer see what is the product which is going to be finished within a period of 3 to 4 years. And I think that is the best guarantee for any buyer and to safeguard his interest. And I think this is something which happens the world over. We should not be selling just on plans and just on paper. We should not be selling on architects' plans. I think we should be selling a product which is very much visible. And that would take some time, because the financing system would have to be worked through with the banks, which happens for every industry. So there is no reason why it can't be done in the housing industry, whether it's a single building project or whether it's a multiple building project. Banks do finance big factories and banks do finance small factories. So I don't think there is any reason to differentiate amongst them, but let the consumer be protected totally. And I think that will come from a practical implementation of the idea that yes, let the sale start after the shell is ready, because then the investment by the builder would be there, all the approvals will be in place, and there would be no reason for anyone to run away from any project, and for the buyer to say that...
On that note, I want to also introduce Mr. Rohit Raj Modi, the Vice President of CREDAI, into this conversation. We were just hearing about Mr. Talwar, talk about what could have also been in the bill. But Mr. Modi, what I want to ask you is, and something that Mr. Talwar was also alluding to, do you think we're going to need the banks to maybe start changing their minds about how they finance the real estate sector? All you builders have basically been relying on the cash, on the deposits that are made by the buyers to fund the projects. Now that's going to be locked in 70% in an escrow account. How are all of you going to find money to build other projects, to expand? So are you going to need the banks to maybe change their idea?
Sure, Nantara. Let me start by saying that CREDAI welcomes the passage of real estate bill, as it would enhance the credibility, transparency and trustworthiness of real estate, benefiting all stakeholders, particularly the consumers. And to answer to the specific question, we also hope that this particular move, and to reap the full benefit of this act, it would be very timely and appropriate that the Ministry of Finance may extend the long elusive status of infrastructure also to housing projects. If the housing projects are granted the infrastructure status, it would automatically resolve the issue of long-term financing. Very much so that in order to reach to a status where the developers would offer only near completion project or projects where the shell has been completed, would require the funding structure in the industry to go through a complete metamorphosis, where today a large part of financial closure is essentially dependent on pre-sales and advances from pre-sales. That has to shift for which the banking will have to become a long-term funding will have to be available to housing sector, both for construction and as well as for land purchase. Because as Rajeev said, that banks do finance factories, be it small or large, and they do long-term funding. But in real estate, when it comes to project finance, it is seen in exclusion from the land component. That needs to modify if we are to reach
the most expensive component.
Yeah, I know. So both the components have to be seen together. Then only we can reach to that kind of financial status.
Mr. Talwar, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, while we're talking about banks financing, etc., in relation to the 70% lock-in, buyers across the country are celebrating the fact that there finally is going to be a regulator, there's going to be a watchdog, they're going to look after their interests. But should they brace themselves for a price hike even in a dead market like today's? I ask you this because it's, developers like yourself are going to lose fungibility of money. You're not going to earn interest on what's in the escrow account. You're also going to have to quote on the carpet area, not the super area. You'll have to make money on the clubhouse facilities, etc., that you're going to provide. So should consumers brace themselves for a price hike? Okay. Mr. Talwar, I was asking you that while it's a red letter day and we all are celebrating this, should buyers brace themselves for a price hike? Because you guys are going to lose fungibility of money given the escrow account. You also have to quote on the carpet area, but you will want to make money on all the other amenities and clubhouses you will be offering.
I think the budget has done something to provide infrastructure status for affordable housing. And this will gradually have to come in because facilities do make a difference. And those are already built into the pricing level. So I don't think there should be any increase in prices. We've seen a decrease in prices to the extent of 35 to 40% over the last 6 to 7 years. But the real reform, I think, which should be expected, this is, as you rightly said, one more watchdog. There are plenty of watchdogs, and this is one more, and I hope it functions well. After all, it's going to be populated by the same people who were the earlier watchdogs, and they should have worked. But the real reform which will come in will only be when banking finance gets in and the consumer is shown the product that he's going to buy. In all likelihood, that should happen as fast as possible because that is where the reform process starts. Putting one more watchdog is not the reform that was expected. Yes, it will certainly provide some protection to buyers, and I hope that happens. After all, in the last eventuality, we are all buyers of property when we want to secure ourselves financially and emotionally. But for the industry to reform, I think there will have to be a reforms package, which, as you mentioned yourself, will be initiated by the Ministry for Urban Development in Government of India and finally done by the Finance Ministry. But a single
the question I was actually asking was that should consumers brace themselves for a price hike? Mr. Modi, come in on that. Given the 70% lock-in in the escrow account, the fact that builders will have to quote on the carpet area, no longer on the super area, but there's no free lunch. You'll want to make money on the clubhouse facilities and other amenities that you're offering. Should consumers start bracing themselves for a price hike?
Well, I think it will require some kind of price adjustment. The carpet area versus super area.
Price adjustment is a price hike, right?
Specifically because I don't see that happening in the running projects, but because the capital will have to be logged in and will have an inefficient or suboptimal usage. So there would be a cost attached to that, and that cost will have to be absorbed either by the developer or by the buyer, so that will have to that extent it will definitely have an impact on the price.
Gulam, what do you think? Do you think Rajeev and Rohit are perhaps being a little diplomatic and consumers should read between the lines and figure out that prices are going to go up?
Well, there will be an impact on the finances, which is evident, as Rajeev spoke about and as even Rohit is talking about. Now, only thing is, as Rohit very clearly said, that it will have to either be absorbed by the buyer or the developer. For me, if I can even think of who could it be, obviously, right now it has got to be the developer because it's very clearly buyer's market. So, at least in the short term, these things will have to be absorbed by the developers only. And only then, if actually they are going out of the pocket, perhaps some part of it can be passed on because currently buyers very clearly are calling the shot. So, I can't see much of a price rise to be passed on to the buyer in the short term.
Mr. Talwar, the other thing I want to ask you about, that this bill has said to create a level playing field, builders will have to charge the same amount as penalty, interest or penalty that they will be offering in case of project delays. We all know that this is very skewed in favor of builders right now, how they pay only 5 to 10 rupees a square foot, but they demand 18% in case a buyer is late by payment by even 15 days. So are you all going to now get back to your lawyers, rewrite your buyer agreements?
Nayantara, you are much too well informed that 18%, which has been flogged almost to death by arguments, is a deterrent charge. If people do not delay payments, there is no question of charging any interest. And if there is a delay, it is universally paid to all the buyers. It is not on a selective basis. So while there has been some debate over this, and of course this figure is being bandied about, it is genuinely not true that all buyers are charged 18% of interest, irrespective of whether they pay on time or not. So to that extent, this argument has a fallacy. But yes, if it is so said that pay and charge the same amount, why not? I mean, whatever seems fair in the eyes of the public.
I wish that all the builders were already doing it.
It should be followed. I don't think there is any reason to not follow such simplification of laws.
But then maybe the builders should have done this themselves, Mr. Talwar, having said that, because there are enough cases like this across platforms, consumer court, CCI, etc. I'm also going to now introduce NM Gattu of DB Realty into this conversation. Thanks, Mr. Gattu, for joining us here. It's a red letter day for home buyers. What I also want to ask you, Mr. Gattu, is that while we're only talking about the residential market, because maybe that has the maximum amount of consumers, this bill is also applicable for commercial real estate. How is this going to impact and rewrite the industry rules?
Hi. Commercial buyers, it is relatively better to deal with because they're all institutional players. And most of these institutional players understand the reasons of the delay. If they are genuine, so bilaterally we can sit across and discuss with them and close the chapter. Unlike the residential forum where you will have hundreds of buyers in a society and it will be relatively difficult to deal with them.
Okay, coming on this, Rohit Raj Modi, it's also going to be applicable for commercial real estate. You have DB Realty saying these, these customers are always better to deal with. I know all of you made lots of appeals to the government that commercial real estate should be left out of the ambit of this real estate regulator bill. Why did you do that? And now that it is included, how is it going to rewrite the rules?
The one reason was that the selling procedure, the entire model is very different. In housing, it's a largely self-finance model where the developer pre-sells the apartments and thereby a lot of third-party interests do get created, right at the initial stage. But in the commercial, a lot of leasing happens, a lot of late-stage construction happens, late-stage leasing happens. And something like this actually brings a lot of gray area in case I need to go for a change at a later date. It requires permissions, two-third majority approvals. All that we felt would definitely halt the process of creation of the office stock, which is so essential for a country like India, which is growing at a rapid pace, and where job creation is the government's one of the primary targets. That is why it was our fervent appeal that commercial be kept out of it, but obviously Parliament in its wisdom has decided to include that as well, and once they have done it, we all would abide by the act which has been enacted.
Mr. Talwar, given your experience in, in government as well as at DLF, you've just heard about how the Parliament has decided to go ahead with including commercial real estate. The next challenge really is going to be for states to adopt all of these laws. How apprehensive are all of you that they're going to stick to what is the Model Act and not deviate too much out of that? While Narendra Modi's government might talk about minimum government, maximum governance, how real is the fear the states may not follow that same principle?
I don't understand this really, because I feel it will be the easiest for states to adopt an act initially, and that's what they do. Then probably it would be discussed in the state legislatures, and if any local tweaking has to be done, it will be done perhaps on the area or maybe to increase some provisions, decrease some, although it is usually in increasing provisions that one has experience. It is not like the state bureaucracies to decrease some provisions, but all the same, as far as minimum government and maximum governance goes, hopefully, if things evolve well, then it would lead to many more clearances and much more scrutiny, which is the real-time scrutiny, and perhaps irrespective of individuals, it can be technology-based, and it can be clearances can also be technology-based. So it may lead to a much more efficient industry in the long run. In the short term, maybe we will see a lot of human intervention and thereby some slowing down. But one has to just wait and see how states and how ready they are to adopt such a model act and how quickly they can tweak it to local conditions.
And Gattu, you know, the municipalities, the state housing boards, etc., are not part of the ambit of the real estate regulator bill. The question I want to ask you is, builders, they can be imprisoned up to 3 years in case they violate repeatedly, but in an environment where you don't get time-bound approvals, where we've all heard about that alleged Babu bill, the nexus, about how corruption is so rampant in trying to get approvals, how is all of this going to work out if you don't have one important stakeholder part of the bill?
I agree with you fully on that dimension, but however, we need to see how this will get embedded into the picture. If those approval process also included, that would have been the best scenario for the builder community without getting prejudiced on our ability to deliver on timelines. But I'm sure that the builders are also going to take these disclaimers, exclusions and limitations within the agreement that this will be subject to so and so, so and so. And once that kind of a disclaimer, exclusion, limitants get included, so I'm sure these bills will over time get changed, altered, and then this important stakeholder will also be brought into the picture and included into the dimension.
Gentlemen, we're completely out of time. I personally could spend all day discussing the real estate regulator bill, but we have to carry on with other news and updates of the day. Thank you so much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18.